For those who are interested, the Beehive Collective, which has done a lot of work around strip mountaintop removal, is at the Museum of Fine Arts this week, and they're having an opening on Monday. So that's another take on what you've done. I noticed when you talked about drawing, and you're looking at yourself in the mirror, you said somebody raising, and then somebody raising to protect themselves. It's the same position to a certain extent. The difference would be the expression on the face, perhaps. And I thought that was interesting that I noticed it as a kind of visual pun, and it might have something, a comment in terms of what you're doing now in looking at the psychology behind all of this.
I mean, that's an interesting observation. I hadn't thought of it quite in that way. I mean, we'll see where my investigations go. What I realize is it's going to be very difficult to get myself up to speed on certain subjects. So I'm going to try to use my interviewing techniques to talk to people who are experts on certain subjects to give me an insight into human nature and things like that. I mean, we'll see what the next few years bring.
First of all, I want to thank you so much. I have an 11-year-old boy, and we spend millions of hours in the Million Years Picnic comic store in Harvard Square. And I can't tell you how elated, because I have the older version of Palestine, the two, without the Edward Said forward. And I saw this on the shelf, and I called my son and I said, look, and it was incredibly affirming to him to see that book on a shelf with the word Palestine and just looking through it. He still hasn't read it. I don't know if he's ready for it. So I'm wondering about the importance of your work in that specific genre of comic books for what it does in terms of educating youth and of somewhat mainstreaming it. It seems like Palestine is a taboo subject for them. And even among his friends, he talks a lot about what he experiences being half Palestinian and what he hears from me, etc. And just seeing that book there and having it on his bookshelf and having his friends see that there's a book on Palestine in that specific genre. So that's like, for me, it's very important, and I feel like there's more to say about that. The other thing is, I didn't know, your work is incredibly meticulous. I mean, it's just the way you described how you actually document what you do. I'm wondering if that's documented somewhere for people to actually see, that that's based on reality and firsthand experience and all of that. And my third question is, did you bring any of these books back with you, or do you intend to show them to people in Gaza and especially the youth in Gaza? I mean, I think it would mean a lot to them to see those books.
Well, to start with your last question about if people in Gaza saw the books, really the people I want to see the books are the older people. Unfortunately, as I was doing the book, I'd get letters from my friends in Gaza saying so-and-so died. They give me like little lists of people who had died since their last email. And those people got older. And it was a bit painful for me to read some of those names and think, well, they'll never see the book that I talked about doing. I've heard relatively good reports from people who managed to get the book in, because it's actually difficult to get anything into Gaza, of course. So I've heard relatively good reports about that. As far as thinking of my work as an educational tool for younger people, that's not how I think of it when I draw it. Though I'm very glad to hear that it has an educational, it can be used in an educational way. But it's more like I'm doing it for myself in this way, and I'm hoping people come along with me for this ride. It certainly didn't feel like I was mainstreaming anything when I started out. I realize now you see my book in bookstores and everything, but when I started, I thought, this is commercial suicide. I mean, a comic book about the Palestinians, because in those days it was actually a comic book. It was collected into book form later. And every few months when one of these comics would come out, I would get my sales figures, and it was always declining and declining and declining because they were only in comic book stores. which usually had mostly superhero stuff and a few alternative things in there. So I was doing it because I felt the need to do it. I felt I just had to do something like this, and in the end it worked out for me. And yeah, if it has educational value, I'm very glad to hear that.
And is it documented anywhere?
Oh,
Your process of
I have very meticulous archives. All my journals, photographs, notes, and there have been some exhibitions of my work that lays out certain stories and how I got them with photographs and all that sort of thing, even tapes.
When they go after you, when they've gone after us, the Israeli lobby, they don't give a damn whether it's documented or not. I mean, we had seen or been at the edge of Han Yunis when Israeli soldiers were shooting at 10-year-old boys, and you had a kind of blitzkrieg black propaganda campaign which began from the premise that Joe and I weren't even there. I mean, that's what they do. And when you feel the heat from that kind of campaign, you realize how utterly insidious and powerful it is. So you can be absolutely the most have the highest, most rigorous standards for reporting, but when you publish these kinds of truths, it's not going to protect you. You had a question? Yeah.
Yeah. I was introduced to your work, Joe, because a friend of mine apparently met you when you were doing Safe Area Garajda, and she claims one of the pictures in the book, she was a war correspondent, is of her. So I don't know if it's true, but her name's Sharif Turgut.
Yeah. Good friend of both of ours.
Oh, okay. Well, she's awesome, and you know that. But I never necessarily believe anyone is that person in the book unless, well, now it's verified. But in any case, I was really fascinated by your descriptions of like the planes you use in drawing and how you use sort of fragmented images to portray chaos but still have it readable. And I once went to Japan to look at how there was the use of information manga to convey news and information, which is much more common than it is here. And I've often thought it would be great, because there are a lot of people who aren't that literate in terms of words, to have more information manga in the US. But you also explained how time-consuming it is to do the work that you do. I mean, could you ever envision there being, I guess, a more common form, not necessarily at the level at which you're doing it and at which you're both working together, but a more common usage of the combination of visual and text storytelling in the US? I would love to see that, but I don't know if it's feasible.
I mean, it's feasible that someone can draw more simply and convey an important story. I mean, I think Marjane Satrapi doesn't put a great amount of detail into her stories, but you still get a sense of the place, and it's not, it's not really necessary. She's trying to tell this very human story. My work, for example, I want the reader to feel like they're there as far as the background goes. I've got that sort of journalistic way of looking at things. It's possible to tell things in different ways. I just happen to have this very sort of meticulous way of doing things because it's part of my nature, in a way. It doesn't mean it's impossible to streamline things. It just means I never cracked that code.
Hi, Joe, I'm John. I'm a Nieman Fellow from the Philippines. I was struck by what you mentioned earlier about the tension between the accurate code and the interpretive drawing. I must confess that although I haven't finished Footnotes in Gaza, I've felt the tension more than once. I guess my suspension of disbelief has been less than willing. The case, for example, I'm trying to think exactly why I encounter this, and I think it's in those instances when you're dealing with a single source whose recollections cannot be confirmed. For example, the guerrilla leader who did not want to be named. he mentioned one raid on this solitary jeep, and even his commander did not believe him. And it's in the story if you read the text. But the logic of images has impressed upon me that, in fact, that raid was true. You get what I'm saying? That I think.
No, I do get what you're saying.
Yeah. So my question is, how do you resolve that? I'm hoping that I'll find the answer at the end of the book, or somewhere towards the end of the book. But how do you resolve that? Is it all subsumed under the search for truth? And
I'm not sure if you can resolve it fully, to be honest. This was a gentleman who basically put me off about 3 times before he talked to me. He might have been, as far as I knew, he was one of the only surviving, or if not the only surviving guerrilla from that particular period. We meant to meet others that turned out to have been long dead. I sat at the UN archives and I read stories of various raids, and some seemed that they could perhaps be his, because they're very specific records of this sort of thing. But he wasn't coming up with anything that seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, one incident, he talked about cutting off people's ears to prove to his Egyptian handler that he was killing these people. I found the document in the UN archives where Israelis were complaining to the UN monitors about ears being cut off bodies. So this sort of thing, and I'd read that before I visited Gaza to do that on that particular trip. This sort of thing made me feel like, okay, I feel like there are elements of the truth in his story that are making me feel like he was there at the time. He didn't seem to be coming out with anything totally outrageous, though I think, your general point is well taken. I did a book called The Fixer, which is about a guy I met in Sarajevo, and it's about the seams in journalism, really. It's about the person who's guiding you around, translating for you, and how much you can rely on that person. Sometimes they have their own agenda. Sometimes they're not translating the full story. And really the book focuses on his stories and then people questioning his stories from various sides, where I'm putting the reader in that same position of not knowing what exactly to think about this individual. So I understand your point. In my own mind, I was like any journalist who's confronted with maybe the last person who remembers this sort of thing. You have to sort of base it on what other evidence you have that perhaps puts this in a light one way or the other. Nothing he was saying was so outrageous from everything I've been reading.
Let me just say, I think throughout Joe's work, he's not afraid of 2 things. He's not afraid of incongruity, and he won't make it simple. And I think that in the passage that you cite, he makes it very clear that there are open questions that over time can't be answered. And the other thing that he won't do is he doesn't sanitize anything. So the power of Footnotes in Gaza or Garage or especially Palestine is that there are scenes in there where the Palestinians don't look too good. And it's that absolute fidelity to truth, even when that truth may reflect badly on the subject, that I think ultimately gives it its power and its force. Because there's that great line of Orwell that a writer should act like a window pane between the reader and the event that they're covering. And I think and we're both huge admirers of Orwell. Joe did a whole comic on Wigan Pier, and I think Joe's fidelity to that in the end, I think that's just a major part of his power.
Are there other cartoonists who came before you who inspired you or made you think that what you wanted to do when you were starting out was going to work?
There are cartoonists who've influenced my drawing. Robert Crumb, quite clearly. It was mainly prose writers. Orwell, of course. Oh, it's funny, always held up by every journalist as the epitome of great journalism, and these same journalists who are very, they bring up objectivity so much. Orwell, I never thought of him as particularly objective.
Well, Orwell wouldn't have lasted 24 hours at the New York Times. But that is a damnation of the New York Times, not Orwell.
But there are other journalists like Hunter S. Thompson, who the spirit of his work really informed how I approached it, because I realized you could put yourself into a story, and in his best work, not all of it, because I think at some point he loses his talents, but in a book like Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, it's clear that he actually understands the intricacies of electoral politics. He knows them quite well. And he's cutting through all the crap and just saying what's really happening from his viewpoint. And because you understand his viewpoint, as a reader, I begin to trust someone like that. I know what side he's down on. He wants McGovern to win. I know that. He's already demonstrated what side he's on, but now he's going to report pretty honestly about what's going on. Another writer I liked was Michael Herr, who sort of also made comments about journalists in wartime situations, put himself in the book to some degree, but he concentrated on atmosphere, which is something I've tried to do too, as much as possible.
I'm really curious about the way you actually collaborate together. Do you write and draw in tandem? Do you sit down once a week, every day? How does that process of collaboration actually work?
Well, it was a real pleasure to work with Chris, because it's just good to see someone who knows what they're doing at work, and you realize there's still things you can learn. I would say Chris did about 95% of the interviewing itself. We sat together. Sometimes I'd interject a question, and at the end it was sort of like, is there anything else? But when you're listening to someone who knows what they're doing, you're constantly coming up with questions that he will ask. So you would have just been repeating what your colleague is going to ask. But we did almost all our reporting together. At some point when we were doing a story together, we'd look at each other and say, this woman would be perfect for the comics section, for example. And then we realized, okay, now I'm going to take that over. When I don't speak Spanish, Chris speaks Spanish, and he was interviewing someone that turned out to be the comic I was going to draw, and he was interviewing her in Spanish while I was taking the notes, because he was driving interviewing her. I was taking notes and she was in the back. And what was great is Chris understands how I work now, so he began asking her very visual questions. The sort of questions that I don't think he would normally ask, but because he knew I would be drawing it, he knew that I needed that sort of information. So we've learned to work together in this kind of way, pretty intimately, I'd say. But we don't sit side by side. We share the interviews we've done. He's not proprietary. He'll send me a long interview, and I chop it down to what I need, and everything else is on the floor. I think we've worked well together.
Yeah, well, partly because I respect his work so much, and I know, I feel that the great scam is I got him to do the book. He's as good a writer as I am, he's as good a reporter as I am, and he can draw. And I just think it's the publisher's really nervous because they don't have a precedent for a book like this. And they always want something unique, but something that's that's safe.
Uniquely safe.
Uniquely safe. But I think I think we both had a vision from it from the beginning. I think we knew that the most potent narratives would be handed over to Joe, because he could do things with those narratives that I, as a writer, couldn't do. And I think it's a really powerful work. And I think it's powerful. It reaches a kind of power because of what Joe's talents are.
Joe, what is your view of ordinary comic books, and have you had contact or communication with, I think, Suleiman Bachit, the Jordanian Arabic comic book entrepreneur?
I haven't. I don't know the individual you just
He
mentioned.
was a TED Fellow last year.
Oh, is that right? I hadn't heard of him, I'm afraid. What do I think of ordinary comic books? I mean, if you're talking about the superhero stuff, I'm not interested. I realize, people are, and that's fine, but it's just not my thing. The things I read are sort of alternative comics, and because I'm so busy, I don't have much time to read even those. It's often what's sent to me by friends or publishers that I know that just send me books. I'm glad to see that comics have, especially alternative sorts of comics, have become such an industry that you can't possibly keep up. There was a time 15, 20 years ago where you could keep up with almost anything that was coming out, and now there are a lot of people working in the field of alternative sort of work, and I'm glad for that. I wish I had more time to read some of that stuff.
Just very quickly, the scene that you showed about the Jeep and the informant in the Jeep, it was such a powerful image, the visual as well as your description of it, and it reminded me of a scene that I just read in a really wonderful book called The Collaborator by a Kashmiri journalist called Mirza Waheed, who works with the BBC in London. And the scene that he describes, and it's a fiction book, and it kind of, when you said that there's more than one way of telling the truth, and fiction is really one way, it really, I thought immediately of that book and that scene. I just wanted to say that was really powerful, and I really loved that.
Oh, thank you.
I just wondered if you thought there was a role for sort of graphic journalism or comics journalism in a more real-time way, whether it be conflict situations or other regular news reporting, something between political cartoons and a graphic novel. I mean, I guess in a simplistic way, somebody, a cartoonist in a war zone, or I don't know what, but it just seems like it's a powerful medium, and I know it's much more labor intensive than other things, but I guess I think of the sort of the potentially serial nature of it, of documenting something in a serial fashion. And I just wonder, A, whether that existed, or B, whether you saw that as any kind of possibility in the knowledge of comics.
I think it's possible with the web, to put something out there right away, but I think it is possible to stretch things and try to get things out as quickly as possible. But I feel the strength of comics is maybe a bit more reflection. I think if you want something immediate, that's the power of photojournalism. And I think that's where photojournalism really has its place. I mean, you get these images coming out right away. They can be posted online as soon as the picture is taken. And I would prefer, with my own work, I prefer to sort of take the longer view of things. I studied journalism, and what I loved about journalism was how quick you had to write stories. 45 minutes, there's the deadline, let's get it done in 45 minutes. It was kind of exciting to think that you could just focus in that way and get something done. I've learned now that I have to get my mind off that kind of journalism and think more in the sort of the broader, take the broader perspective, take a step back, try to look at the context of things, and that's how I have to report my stories, because I think I'm going to be beaten every time if it comes to speed.
I think that great journalism, like John Hershey's Hiroshima, can be elevated to a form of art, and I think that that's what Joe does. That in the end, it is great journalism, but it's elevated to a form of art, which is very different from churning out a story for tomorrow's newspaper.
Maybe we should take one more question.
Yeah.
Do either of you get a sense of what is holding the people in Gaza together psychologically, giving them strength, to cope with their dire, the oppression?
This one, praying 5 times a day. Because when you have nothing, when you have no job, when you have no place to live, other than a concrete hovel that you share with 10 other people, when you have no ability to travel, when you have no future, when there's no structure to your life at all, including any assurance where you're going to eat. Praying 5 times a day becomes the scaffolding by which you retain your sanity. And one of my greatest frustrations, and something that I've spent a lot of time since I came back from the Middle East speaking about, is this demonization of Islam and of Muslims in this country. You know, what we say about Islam and Muslims could not be said about any other ethnic group. It is so patently racist and disgusting. And when you come out of Gaza, you come away with a deep, deep respect for the power of this religion to hold people together who have nothing.
Good. It's a good way to end it.